You're listening to This is Yoga Therapy. I'm your host, Michelle Lawrence, and I've had the opportunity to interview many of those who are making a difference at the intersections of yoga and health. And I'm here to share with you their stories and conversations. Thanks for listening. In today's episode, I interviewed Susi Hately. Susi's a yoga teacher, a CIAYT yoga therapist. She's a teacher trainer, speaker, and author with a BSc in kinesiology. As the founder of Functional Synergy, she's transforming, inspiring, and setting a new standard in the global community of health through yoga therapy and functional movement therapy. Her 4-day online program, Power of Pure Movement, Strong and Supple Feet, has proven to improve the mobility and stability of her clients. We're going to talk about her work and insights related to training the body for optimal health. It's so great to meet you and have you here on the podcast today, Susi.
Thank you for having me. This is a real pleasure. And as we mentioned before we got recording, is our yoga therapy world is a small world. So being able to connect and share and teach, it's awesome. It's awesome to have this as an opportunity to connect.
That's great. Well, I'd love if you could share with our listeners a bit more about yourself. How did you first come to yoga and then get on this path of yoga therapy?
So I came into yoga, oh goodness, I was in my 20s and I had a bunch of chronic pain symptoms, as that's what we called it back then. We didn't use the word persistent back then. That had developed over the later teen years. And I was quite an athletic person in my later teen years. And I was sort of in the last phase of graduating from university. And so I had no money and there's only so many practitioners I could go to help me. And my roommate, he was a new roommate. I just moved to a new city and I was renting a room in this one location. And she said, you really should try yoga. And I'm like, oh God, why would I do that? But I had really nothing else. And yoga was inexpensive and all the things. And I remember being on my mat, or the mat that I borrowed from the place in the church, and looking around the room thinking, does anyone else think this is crazy? Like, am I the only one who thinks this is absolutely absurd? And something clicked for me though. Like there was a light bulb moment that even though my athletic mindset was like, this is absurd, something in my body mind was like, this is what you need to do. And then I went religiously every week. And then the persistency of the symptoms went away within 4 months. And I was back running a 10K in 4 months. Well, the pain went away sooner than that, but I was running 10K in 4 months. And the interesting thing about it is I was working at a clinic. I was working at what was called a chronic pain center as well, working with PTs and OTs, and the folks who were there were in a pretty bad state. They had been in either motor vehicle accidents or work-related accidents, and they were sort of near the end of the road with insurance. And so we were doing very traditional styles of therapy, and I started integrating what I was learning at yoga. And I didn't really know what I was doing. I just was seeing what worked and applied it in the way that I knew biomechanics and kinesiology, and threw in a little bit of breath along with it. And lo and behold, not surprisingly, people got better faster. And I'm like, all right, so I'm on to something here. And I kind of kept at it. I couldn't see at all a way to make a living at it. So I kind of let that go very quickly, but kept at it and kind of kept at this thing. And it just sort of, as these things sometimes go, it was a very organic way that I found myself doing my teacher training, then ultimately teaching classes, and the rest is history.
So great. I love it. And it sounds like really integrating what was working for you as you were going along was a way to kind of test out how these methods and methodologies work on other people too. Isn't that right?
Yes. And I was fortunate in the sense that I had a place to explore. And again, it was very organic, right? Like I didn't go to the yoga class in order to learn something to then apply. I applied something. I was like, I have pain and this has worked for me. And maybe this could work for these folks. And then I started to kind of pin and pull things together bit by bit. And when I was teaching classes, I remember getting one of those prime time slots, one of my first teaching gigs. And it was a regular yoga class. And the director, we didn't have drop-in back then. It was all registered series. And the director had said, this is what needs to happen at the end of these 8 weeks. This is the outcome that needs to happen. And I looked at the group and I looked at the outcome and I'm like, oh boy, this isn't going to happen. But it was this prime spot. I'm like, I really want to maintain this spot. And this is a great leaping off ground. And that's really where I kind of started the way that I now teach. Like that was really the inception, which is
toward outcomes.
Yeah. And she had said they needed to be doing, I can't remember all the poses, but it was like, here are the set of positions and poses that the people need to be able to do. And I looked at the group and I'm like, well, they don't have the hip mobility for this. And they clearly don't have the shoulder stability for this. And they clearly don't have these other connections. So what on earth am I going to do? And I had already kind of stepped away from the way of modifying, which is very common after a 200 hour. Yeah. And I went into this place of, all right, what needs to happen in these positions so that they are able to do them? And that's when I started to really break movement patterns down into the small granular movements and component parts. And then by the end of the 8 weeks, they were all doing the positions. And the other outcome, which didn't so much surprise me, but enthralled me for sure, is a number of them who had pain didn't have pain anymore. And that's when I started to really connect when people move better, they feel better. And so when I ultimately left that position a couple of years later, I think it was, I can't remember what the time frame was, and I opened up a little space inside of a Pilates studio, I was moving in the direction at that point of helping people with pain and with yoga. And that's where I started is, all right, you know what? When people with pain move better, their pain goes down. So I'm going to just keep fostering this notion that when they move better, their pain goes down. And that was really the next level of it, the next layer of it.
Yeah, that makes so much sense to me. And so I'm going to maybe ask you how that evolved. You touched on some of this already, but here we are today. And it looks like you specialize in pain, anatomy, biomechanics, and physiology. So what does it look like to work with you as a yoga therapist?
So this won't surprise you or people listening is I start with the body. So I come in the conversation from someone comes to me and they have persistency in physical symptoms. And they might have other things going on. There might be some anxiety, there might be some depression, but the primary piece of what they're wanting to resolve is from their physical body. So that's where we begin. And very quickly, we move from the Annamaya Kosha into other layers of Kosha, and not specifically because I'm directing it that direction. It's more that they start to recognize that as they're moving better and they have more ease or whatever word it is, for some people, they feel it as more ease. For some people, they feel it as more peace. For some people, it feels lighter or taller. And then as they learn to move in that quality of range of motion, they start to recognize other aspects of how this plays out in their life. And they're the ones who make that connection. And that's something I'm actually quite deliberate about because early on in my career, it was sort of kind of drummed into me that as a kinesiologist, as someone in biomechanics, you don't go over into the emotional space. And yet in those early days, it was clear that the emotional space had a role to play in the body space, but I wasn't like in my head, I'm like, I can't go there. I'm not allowed to go there. And so then what I ended up doing is, and it wasn't like I was deliberate back then about it. I just saw the pattern. I saw clearly the way that someone was in their mind and the way that someone was emotionally was showing up in how they were moving. I kind of talked to that in their movement and they were able to piece it all together themselves and started to recognize these correlations to, like I call it yellow lights or the whispers. And so when someone's pain goes down, I would ask them, okay, so what's present now? And they'd say, well, there's no pain. And I'm like, okay, but there's something present, right? Because if there's no pain, you're still kind of focusing towards pain. So what's actually in the space? And that's where they would come up with whatever word was there. And then when I'd say, okay, now move in that range of motion, then they would do that. And then something else would arise where it's like, oh, now I feel this other thing, like meaning lightness or groundedness or something. So they were starting to develop this language for like what we call now interoceptive feeling in their body. They were getting more proprioceptively aware. And this kind of groundedness space that they were gaining they started to recognize yellow lights or the whispers associated with other aspects of their life. And so they were able to pin these together. And I find the beauty of this around starting with the body is very, very objective. You either move or you don't move. You compensate or you don't compensate. So we don't have to get into making it mean a bunch of stuff, although sometimes we do. It really becomes something, okay, here's what's happening. And then as we shift it, it's like, well, here's what's happening. So they can see it really, really clearly and quite cleanly.
Everything you said there really resonates for me too. And what I have come to understand about pain and us as humans and how yoga works, right? So, but you said it so really eloquently, and it's obvious to me that this is something that you've been working with for a while and is working for your clients too. I'm going to switch gears just a little bit and see if we can get specific for a moment and talk about our feet. Like, if we're going to talk about the body, let's talk about the feet, right? I mean, the base of our bodies. And I believe this is also an area that you focus on in your work. And from what I understand in prepping for this, about 87% of people experience painful feet for various reasons at some time in their lives. And I'm one of those people. And so can you educate our listeners a bit on where foot pain stems from in the body and how do we get out of pain? What are the right, and I put those in quotes, movements to foster strong and supple feet?
Well, what's so interesting is that stat is fascinating because I think the other stat that's interesting is that 80% of people experience back pain one time or more times in their life. And that foot pain is actually a lot more often, which that's very, very curious and very interesting. And for me, when people come to see me, they've usually had some gain in getting out of the pain related to their feet, but it hasn't been consistent. Like if someone has plantar fasciitis or they've got some other like unnamed or undiagnosed, but just achy pain, they've figured out some things that they can do, like they can roll their foot out on a ball, or there's some type of foot stretching or massaging that they can do, and that it comes back. And what I like to talk about is the mechanics of this, because there are some amazing foot trainers out there. Like there's lots of programs that deal with the feet, and there's some really good exercises that are very specific to whether it's plantar fasciitis or an overly pronated foot or flat feet or bunions or neuroma or any of that. Like there's some really good, very specific exercises for those factors. And what I find can be missing is moving beyond the localness of the feet to further afield, because when you look at the tissue of the feet, there's local muscles, like there's muscles that attach to the body, like around the foot locally and intrinsically to the foot. And then there's muscles and connective tissue that connects elsewhere away from, but connects onto the feet as well. So there's a connection, there's a chain that moves outside of the foot. And when you look, even if you zoom out just a little bit more from that and you look at something like the walking pattern, what is required for the walking pattern to happen is the leg has to move in the hip socket. And that if that leg does not move, like the femur, if it doesn't move well in the hip socket, well, then the foot's not going to land really well. So there's a certain amount of influence that the hip has on foot placement, and not only on the same side hip, but the opposite hip, right? Because when you're walking, the one leg will be on the ground, or the one foot on the other side will be on the ground while the other leg is swinging through. And so there's got to be a level of stability that's happening through that standing leg. And so if that's not happening, that can have an impact on where that foot lands and how the foot lands. And so we're looking at how that leg bone is moving and also how it's stabilizing in the hip. So then when you look at that, then you see, well, it's the pelvis is a part of that joint. So then where the pelvis, then I like to call it as being a platform on which the leg bone moves. But here's what's also interesting. We're going to keep going further afield. And part of the gait pattern is that there's a bit of rotation in the torso. So now we're looking at how the pelvis and the rib cage connect and how well there's some rotation, and if there's some rotation or not, or like sometimes someone is hiking the hip because they don't have great rotation or great movement of the leg bone in the hip socket. So then they hike their hip, and so they're not doing a lot of rotation, and their QL is getting overly involved. And we can keep kind of taking this up a level, but I usually stop there because if I go further up to the shoulder girdle right away, people then kind of get lost. They're like, but hold on a second. How does the shoulder girdle connect to the hip? But when we go rib cage to pelvis and seeing the pelvis is really a central piece to this, then they stay with me, right? So then when we start to clear up a lot of those movement patterns between leg and pelvis and rib cage, then it's like, oh, my feet feel different. Oh, and then they start to connect whatever is being done locally and intrinsically to the foot, whether that's with me, whether that's through another practitioner, whether that's through like traditional medical means, whatever those are, then they can integrate the gains that they're making with their feet with the overall movement patterns of their leg and pelvis, whether they are someone who walks a lot or someone who has to stand or whatever they have to do through their day-to-day, right? And so it becomes so when you asked about different exercises, there's so many. I mean, it's difficult to explain those in an audio format, but the idea, I think the concept that I think people who are listening will certainly understand is that when we play around with mobility and stability of how that femur is in the pelvis and what's happening between the pelvis and the rib cage, we can make such fundamental change with what happens with the feet.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And we do so much compensating, right, throughout our whole body. And we didn't even talk about what we're wearing on our feet and how that might impact it, right?
Totally. And I kind of, this might sound funny, but there is one thing I'm a little bit proud of, and that's when I've got a client who comes to me and says, okay, Susie, I'm feeling better, but you know what? Later this week, I really want to wear these really sexy shoes. And I know they're awful. I know, but I really want, or the boots, or at least it's one of those things. I'm like, you know what? Life is worth enjoying. Let's help you out with this. Let's help you go there. You know that it's probably not the best thing, but heck, you're going to have fun doing it. So let's help you get there so that you can enjoy those sexy shoes and those sexy boots and, whatever that is. And it's funny because we'll help them get supple and stable. And usually they've made already some gains. They have enough awareness. And then when they finish up their night or their day with their sexy boots and shoes, then they know how to take care of themselves. So it's not like I'm all with you. Like, let's get the footwear that actually works for your feet. And then sometimes it's kind of like, sometimes you just got to have ice cream. Sometimes you just got to have some fun. And there's something more to just moving well. Like there's a life that we can, if sexy boots and shoes are part of your best life, then let's help you go there. Yeah.
Absolutely. And there's also this piece about awareness too. Right now we're aware even that these shoes, these boots are not the ones I should be wearing every day. Like I didn't have that awareness when I was in my 20s, right? You'd think. And I think just even having the awareness piece around that is huge. And then of course we want to have fun. Of course, we get to enjoy life's pleasures from time to time. That would be awful if we couldn't. So let's talk about your guiding principles. I noticed them, and these are really good. I noticed them when I was looking at your website, and they remind me a little bit of some of the pain care yoga principles that we teach in our program through Neil and Lisa Pearson's work. So I wonder if you can just share with our listeners a bit more about each of these. So functional synergy's key values are, number 1, healing is possible. Number 2, tissue can change. And number 3, the problem isn't always where the pain is. These are really good.
Awesome. So healing is possible arose out of, there's a lot of people who in some sense have a level of commitment to the experience of pain that they have, whether it's through resignation or not having great care or having someone tell them that they're going to have to manage pain forever. And I've been at this for long enough that I couldn't ignore the changes that people were having. And early in my career, when I was doing a lot of therapeutic group classes, I saw a lot of people. I was teaching 13 classes a week, 10 people per class. There were a lot of people that I saw with a lot of different things. And whether it was psoriasis or rheumatoid arthritis or like autoimmune type of conditions, or whether it was orthopedic conditions that in some cases seemed more simple in a sense but particularly with some of these like long standing, like I think about my husband, for example, he's got psoriasis, but you would never know it now because he hasn't had a flare since 2018. Or I think about another client of mine who has been diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, but she hasn't had a flare in years. And so it's not to say that they aren't diagnosed with that anymore. That's not my point. It's that they don't have the flares anymore. So they don't have, like, there's still this condition that maybe the light switch has been turned on for that, like genetically or whatever. I'm not sure how all that actually works, but their experience of the condition is entirely different.
Yeah, their quality of life, right?
Yeah, and they're not managing the symptom, right? Like it's gone beyond that. Like they've, as I mentioned with the yellow lights and the whispers, they've tuned into the factors that have led to flares. And so now they're able, like my husband, he was saying, this was quite a while ago when we were talking about this with we've got a set of twins who are 7.5, and each of them have had little things that have occurred in their lives where I've gotten the opportunity to teach them about feeling their body. And we were telling our son about, his dad, and they don't know him as ever having psoriasis. And so we were showing some old pictures of him, and they were like, wow, like he was pretty red. And he was saying a story about how, there was one time that I could feel a little bit of itchy, and I just knew that I needed to make a couple of changes. It was letting me know that this was happening, right? Like he calls it, he was starting to get depleted, and there's some other factors that were creating some stress, and his skin was asking for attention, right? So he's not like figuring out and managing. He's now like, oh, okay, my body has these messages and I get to listen to them and then act upon them. And so that's what I find is really the healing nature, is because healing is ultimately a transformative process. There's a retraining piece of it. It's a new habit development piece. And it's not so much that we unlearn things, because that to me sometimes feels very, very effortful, but rather we get to learn new things. And then as we learn those new things, and then those habits become more the default way of being.
Yeah.
And we just kind of keep moving. And we know that we have these other ways of being because they've been with us. I mean, the story I like to share with people is I want you to remember when you were 4. And I bet you have a memory, whether it's a positive or not positive memory, and you can viscerally remember it. Like those things don't go away, but we might not pull from those ways of being when we were 4, now that we're whatever age, but the ways of being from when we were 4 still exist in us, right? So there's still this imprint of that experience that's there, but we can also have different patterns. So to me, that's the healing piece. It's not, oh, we're going to fix this thing and you are going to be the same person. It's, we are actually going to enable this transformation of sorts through a very step-by-step, bit-by-bit, slow process that actually will yield results very quickly as we go in this very, very deliberate, specific way. So then that leads into the tissue can change, because when I think about movement patterns, when we think about the brain or the nervous system and muscular or myofascial system and the skeletal system, it's the brain that's telling the muscle or myofascial system like how far and how fast to contract, when to start, when to stop. And then that moves the skeleton. And I think a lot of times we can get focused in on like what muscle needs to strengthen and what muscle needs to release. And I tend to take it a step back and go, okay, what's this neuromuscular patterning that needs to shift? How do we improve the motor control and coordination? And when we start to play around with reducing compensation patterns, like first becoming aware of them and then reducing them, and then building from there, that's the change of the neuromuscular pattern. We're deliberately shifting, quieting a compensation pattern. And what I mean by compensation patterns is we're borrowing from one area of our body to try to make another area stronger. But what we're ending up doing is making the whole system weaker, because what we're borrowing from is not intended to do the movement. So we end up making the whole system more fatigued or more depleted, or whatever quality you want to throw in there. And so if we can quiet that down, and then as we quiet that down, what actually needs to move starts to be nurtured, then we can kind of play this quieting and nurturing relationship. And that's when that neuromuscular pattern, that's when the motor control and coordination begins to shift and improve. And so then the tissue can change. Like we don't have to have the tissue might not be as ropey. It might not be like We had a client the other day who is adamant that her glutes were lazy. And then 25 minutes in, we were doing a bunch of things and she's like, oh, my glutes aren't lazy. They're like firing, but we didn't do anything with the glutes. Everything was like reducing compensation and nurturing movement. And then she came back up into whatever movement she was doing. And she's like, oh, how did that happen? Right. So the patterning changed, right? Her tissue started to get that opportunity to shift. And then that's been sustained over now a few weeks. And she's now seeing possibility in a way that she didn't see before, which is, wow, like I don't have to manage this hip thing. I actually can live in a very, very different way, right? With that mindset really is powerful, which then kind of highlights that where the pain isn't necessarily the problem. And as we reduce, like, first of all, like when we recognize that there's these compensation patterns, oftentimes they're not directly in the area of where the pain is. They're often somewhere in a neighboring joint or even further afield. And then as we clear that up and that area of pain settles out, usually someone's a bit like, what? Because even though we know we came from two cells, there's such a consistency out there of, if you've got shoulder pain, do these exercises at the shoulder, which is fine, it can help. And if there's that undercurrent of compensatory strategy, that's going to still be there, even if you're strengthening on top of it. And you may have more bandwidth to do the things that you do. And if you're willing to go into that compensation pattern, to go into that place where the pain isn't, and then we clean those things up. We're no longer borrowing from areas that aren't involved, necessarily needing to be involved in a movement pattern, getting the area that's meant to be, and that's when we can really change things up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really, really great. And it's also very hopeful.
Yeah, totally.
Well, I'd love to kind of wrap up talking about you. So you provide all this amazing work out in the world for folks to get out of pain and improve living. I'd like to know what you do to nurture yourself on a regular basis. Maybe you have a daily practice. We put a lot of importance on that in our training programs. And then I imagine you do too, because you wouldn't be able to do the work that you're doing in the world. I'm sure of that. I'm certain of that if you didn't have your own daily practices.
Yes. And sort of one of my guiding mantras is we want to eat our own cooking and not throw up. And that's just sort of a fun and cute way that sometimes practice what you preach is a little too serious for me. So if I'm eating my own cooking and if I find myself saying something to someone and teaching, I'm like, ooh, it's kind of like the Gandhi, whether that's an urban myth or not, around the woman who takes her son to Gandhi and says, tell him not to eat sugar. And then Gandhi says, well, no, bring him back next week. And then she comes back and he says, stop eating sugar. And then she's like, why didn't you just say that before? And he goes, because I was eating sugar. Right. So it's, right. There's a certain, whether that's true or not, I don't know, but there's a certain element to like, yeah, eating your own cooking. And there's a few aspects to that. The first one is that I really center my life around rest. I know that in order, like there's a lot of cognitive processing that I do running a business and supporting people in curriculum development. And there's also the output of energy that's required when I'm teaching and the levels of teaching that I do. So rest as a construct is fundamental to the way that I live my life. I take a significant amount of time for what that would be. And changes in terms of what is nurturing for rest. That changes periodically through the year, depending on the season. I've kind of by happenstance, in a similar way that I fell into yoga, we needed Ayurveda training as part of the IYT program. And one of my graduates from one of my lower level programs has become an Ayurvedic doctor. And she and I have been working together for a long, long time with various other Ayurveda stuff she was doing. And a lot of it I got through osmosis. And then I took a deeper training with her a couple of years ago. And so that does run my life quite a bit, not in like I have to do this because Ayurveda says it, but rather I'm noticing these qualities showing up through the seasons and the transitions of seasons. And what am I actually, as my body feels into the changing of energies, what do I need? So that's sort of in the background consistently. And I watch that with my kids. I teach my kids how to feel their bodies, especially when they've been through a couple of things for themselves. And it's really powerful. Like those two they really do feel what's going on in their world in their own way, which is super fun. And then I have a practice. I have a morning or an evening, depending on how the day flies, where I do a combination of whether it's movement work or asana work or pranayama, and a stillness practice, which isn't necessarily so much of a meditation. It's a quiet practice. And I also love being on my bike. And when I'm on my bike, I'm very much thinking about the concept of asana as being one of being present and being aware and stiram sukham. So I'm not like gritting my teeth and there, like I'm definitely putting effort out, but I'm thinking about what the essence of asana is, of sitting comfortably and still, and as I'm putting out that effort. So it kind of weaves through, like it's a consistency. I also run my business in a very similar way, where the alignment of what I am teaching or how I am teaching is showing up within my business. And not everybody who is involved in my business who helps me with it does a yoga practice. They all have a very strong belief in what it is that we're doing and what we're up to. But the more the key is the dialogue and how we're interacting with each other. And when we do get into those places, which sometimes happens, of like chaotic busy, then we recognize that and we're like, okay, at what point will we come back to this more calm, busy space? And so we feel when we're kind of reaching out a little bit, and there's a kind of a consistency of recognizing that we ultimately don't want to be there, and what's required to bring it back, right? And so that can sometimes happen when you bring on new team members, and there's onboarding and there's training and all that, and there's a little bit of like push in those early phases of bringing on people, but then it settles out. So when we know that there's like a date, like we have a sense like this is when it's going to smooth out, right? There's an up leveling kind of thing. When we up level in our movement practices or our yoga practices, there's usually some sort of uncertainty in that space, and then you get to that new level. So that's kind of how it meanders through my life.
I love it, and I can relate on a lot of different levels, including the fact that I have twins, and I know,
fun,
and I have some familiarity with what it's like to be in that energy too. But I've just really enjoyed speaking with you today, Susie, meeting you and learning about what you do, and thank you so much for your time.
This has been lovely. Thank you very much.
If you'd like to learn more about who we are and what we do, visit us at innerpeaceyogatherapy.com.